right, we are getting started. As people are joining, we're gonna hold off on the formal introductions and we're gonna do a fun little, we'll call it an icebreaker, get to know you, to share some of your backgrounds. Cybersecurity is a wild world that is evolving rapidly, and I don't know many people who sat down in elementary school and said, Mom, I really want to go into the world of cybersecurity. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about our panelists here and how you all landed in this space. So let's see, Kim, why don't you kick us off? How did you get into the world of security?
Sure. Yeah, I was not a third grader who thought, "Ooh, this is what I'm going to do for a living one day." Honestly, I thought I wanted to go to law school. I was someone who went into college being like, "Ooh, I think this is where my future is headed." And then senior year was like, "Actually, I don't think I want to do more school right now. I want to sort of see what's out there." So when I was looking for something within business, I was like, "Okay, what can I use that applies a lot of the same interests I had with like the legal world, which is a set of rules that you follow, understanding and interpreting what you do with those rules, trying to help a business sort of protect themselves and their customers, a little bit of how do we protect them from a data perspective too." And it sort of was just the greatest like mesh of all things when I was like, oh, security, compliance, all of that that's out there is really sort of the more maybe technical side, but a lot of legal world is involved in that too. So sort of that interest was what drove me to look for jobs that I didn't even really know existed yet, but I found a home that I really enjoyed in it.
That's so cool. Yeah, I think so many people think about the technical side of security and don't think about coming at it from the legal side
Yeah.
for their first roles. That is a very cool background. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
John, what about you? I know you've had a rich history in the cybersecurity world. How did you get started?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I actually started in quality at statistical process controls way back when. I hate to date myself, but back in the 1980s, and as ended up being the director of regulatory affairs. And through that process of statistics and quality and data privacy and data retention and just all the things it just kind of grew into that. And so actually ended up going to school for that as I was working. And so my organization back in the day, uh, sort of helped push me into that direction. It was just something that I had a passion for, and I really liked it, and kind of grew from there. And ended up at the British Standards Institution, retired in 2018, and then came over to CSA as a research fellow.
You make it sound easy. It was just
Well, it wasn't not easy, but we only got an hour.
exactly. And Kelly, how about you? How did you land in the world of security?
Yeah, so I've been in tech for 10 years and I have been both an engineer and in sales. And so I've encountered the issue of security questionnaires and security from different angles. It's a problem I keep running into in my career. And finally, one that I saw an opportunity to solve. So that was really exciting to me. And that's how I ended up here at Hypercomply in this space.
Amazing. And we are lucky to have you. And with that, we will officially kick things off. I am Ashley Kemper. I'm on the marketing team here at Hypercomply. Welcome to our webinar where we are talking about all things security questionnaires. I'm excited to have a panel put together here of security experts. As you just heard a little bit of their backgrounds, I will do some more formal introductions in case you're just joining and didn't catch that. We'll do introductions and then we'll jump right into our questions and learn all about security questionnaires. Joining us today, we have John DiMaria. He is an Assurance Investigatory Fellow and Research Fellow at the Cloud Security Alliance. He has 30 years of experience working in the cybersecurity space, so he has seen it all, heard it all, and is ready to tackle your questions today. We're also joined by Kim Elias. She is the Security and Compliance Program Manager at Vendor, a SaaS buying platform. She's previously run compliance programs at Buildium and Carbonite. And finally, we have Kelly Wazuri. She is the head of product at HyperComply, where she is building solutions to turn security questionnaires from a source of pain into a strategic advantage for companies. So welcome to our panelists. Thanks for being here. And really quickly, for those of you who aren't familiar, I'd also like to quickly introduce HyperComply. HyperComply is a third-party risk management platform that automates security reviews and due diligence processes. We know that the security questionnaire process today is broken, and we are going to talk all about that, why it is. And typically, senior security and compliance leaders, like many of you watching, spend hours and hours copying and pasting security details into these awful questionnaire forms that can take weeks to put together. HyperComply uses AI to automatically complete questionnaires, and a security expert reviews every response to ensure high quality. If you're interested in learning more, go to hypercomply.com to check us out. With that, let's dive in. We are going to start with the very basics because there are a lot of unknowns in this space. So I'd like to start with why security questionnaires exist. Why do companies use security questionnaires? And to kick things off, John, I will hand this one to you. Tell us why they're here.
Yeah, I've filled out many myself and sent many, and now I've actually sort of help people understand this as well. But I think people send out questionnaires as a screening process, but they're really based on their perceived risks of you as an organization or suppliers as an organization. So they're really trying to, in many cases, just check a box, unfortunately, because especially in today's world, you don't have opportunity to actually go anywhere live to actually see someone. So there has to be a process. And so they provide these security questionnaires, that are based on many things. Sometimes they're just based on the standards. I used to get security questionnaires from customers that were basically took ISO 27001, copied it down, put their name on it, and said, "Here, fill this out." so it's really sort of a hodgepodge of what they use and why they use it, but it's all about perceived risk. And so I know we'll get into some of these other issues later, but yeah, it's just a screening process. What I see is that what our clients tell us many times is just, it seems like they're there to check a box, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So yeah, and they're trying to do some sort of due diligence to help improve transparency and trust in their suppliers.
For sure. And speaking of those suppliers, I think, Kim, you have an interesting perspective at vendor. You manage your team's internal security and compliance, but you also help to enable that for your customers who are going through the procurement process. They're trying to buy new tools. So what do you hear from customers, or what do you see internally that causes the need for these security questionnaires? Is it the check the box that John is saying? Do you hear other things?
I think for a lot of people, it is check the box, right? You have a vendor management program, you have a security team that says, hey, we need you to have suppliers fill out this form. And we need to, have this pretty early on before we can even know if we're going to move forward with people. I think on the other side, though, you do have teams of people who either have a pretty big internal security function, or they have maybe a more developed framework that they use, that they say, hey, we actually need to know if this supplier or this vendor is going to meet our needs, if they're going to meet the baseline that we set when it comes to security. And I think for people that's difficult. It seems like an almost a task that's too big to actually complete. But a security questionnaire is really the place to start with that. So I think we see from people, and I experience this as well internally, but we want them to be good. We want them to be effective. We also want them to be streamlined. We don't want to spend hours and hours reviewing them, sending them, coming up with questions to ask, and then a lot of back and forth. You want it to be good, but simple, and that's obviously harder than it sounds.
Yeah, I think that balance is kind of the crux of the problem for a lot of people. They know they have to do this. They've got to check that box. And if they're checking the box, they kind of want to get something useful out of it. They want to build confidence in the people they're working with. How do you see companies try to manage that balance? How are they trying to make this process as useful for themselves as possible?
I think a lot of times people are relying on third-party tools like HyperComply. They're saying, hey, okay, we don't have the function right now internally to totally handle this on our own. So let's use a third-party tool that will help us more effectively do that. I think they are also relying on what they see other, leaders in the space doing. Okay, I received this questionnaire from a company that I'm using. Maybe this is what I should be using as well, and using that as a framework. I think you can always rely on other people in your space. You can ask your auditing firm, you can ask, an external security person, who works at a company. But I think mostly it depends on what space you have in your own internal company to focus on that, and then sort of relying and leveraging on where there are opportunities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. John, I know you've been involved in actually building some of these, third-party questionnaire templates and best practices. So without getting too technical, what should companies include? Like, what are the high-level areas that companies need to assess to actually get useful information in the questionnaire process?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we concentrate on cloud, sector specific controls, cloud control matrix, and that are controls specifically for cloud service providers. But having said that, in more generic terms, it's about understanding all of the people, process, and technology together. Some questionnaires get very technical. They want to know about your technology, your encryption, your firewalls, so on and so forth. But they sort of exclude the people and process part of that, which is usually the biggest issues that organizations have from a security posture perspective. So it should be unique. It should be focused on the industry or sector that you're addressing in your procurement system. It shouldn't be this generic, like I said, don't copy the ISO 27001 standard and send it out with your name on it, because it's really not helping you very much, and people kind of roll their eyes at that. So it should have some value to it. It should be, the idea should be the due diligence of understanding the organization itself, their culture, the people, the processes and procedures that they use, along with the technology as well. And it should be something that's generally accepted in that particular industry, so that you sort of keep down the number of questionnaires that are out there. But it also must be easy to evaluate, as well as I think that Kim said. It's one of those things where we have tools. There are tools out there that help people answer these questionnaires. The reason those tools are so popular is because it's a huge task, not only answering them, but evaluating them. If you have 1,000 vendors, you send them all questionnaires and they come back, are you going to evaluate every single answer? And are you going to contact them on negative answers? It becomes a huge task. So again, we get back to the check the box thing. You'd want to try to stay as far away from that as possible. So so our questionnaires, or we have one questionnaire, but it's sort of a generally accepted global practice, and those are the types of questionnaires that you want to sort of use that people are familiar with.
Absolutely. And in our product, of course, we do offer the Cake Light questionnaire, which is created by the Cloud Security Alliance. It's one of the templates that we offer up for customers. And I know, Kelly, you've been spending a lot of time recently talking with customers and getting more insights from them about how they use industry standards or where they need to customize. And I'm curious if there are any insights you can share in what some of the common custom questions or custom subjects are that people want to include above and beyond what's typically included.
Yeah, sure. So what I think is really interesting about security questionnaires is that what customers are really trying to get at is to understand a third-party security and compliance posture, to get a picture or a story about whether this company really cares about compliance and security. And even if they do care, whether they have the resources on their team to ensure that the data that they're sharing with this third party is secure and private. And so they'll go about that in a lot of different ways. And using something like the Cake Light and industry standards is a really good way to make sure you have coverage across a lot of topics. You have broad coverage, and looking at somebody's SOC 2 report is also another way that you can kind of check the box and make sure that they meet certain basic requirements. But it doesn't cover everything. So for example, data privacy as it relates to GDPR is a topic that comes up all the time. That's probably the number one topic. Customers usually want to add a couple of questions about data privacy to make sure that companies are, if they're not fully GDPR compliant, if they are at least have some measures in place to ensure data privacy.
Got it. And you ticked off one of my bingo buzzwords, which is SOC 2, which comes up a lot and is very intertwined with the idea of security questionnaires. So first, in layman's terms, can you give us a quick rundown of what it means to be SOC 2 certified?
Yeah, so being SOC 2 certified means that you have gone through an audit with an auditor to ensure that you meet the requirements of SOC 2 around 5 principles. And the difficulty with SOC 2 is that you can meet these requirements and principles in a variety of different ways. It's not like you meet a list of 1 through 100 requirements that every company is the same. There's a variety of ways that you can implement your security of your infrastructure and your application. There's a variety of ways that you can implement processes in your company to ensure that data remains private and secure. And so that's what the audit is for. And so being SOC 2 compliant means that you have gone through that audit and passed that audit.
Awesome. Thank you for making that easy to understand. I know one of the follow-up questions that we hear from folks a lot is, I'm SOC 2 certified. Why do I need to do security questionnaires? Or the company that I'm buying from is SOC 2 certified. Do I really need to send them a questionnaire? So Kim, I'll toss this one to you. Do you still need to send questionnaires to companies who are SOC 2 certified? Isn't that enough?
I've got a short answer and a longer answer. My short answer is no, I don't think that's enough, but it depends. My longer answer is it depends on how your company works and what your risk level is as a business and its security department. SOC 2 is great, but what are you getting from that SOC 2? Hopefully you're looking at, the baseline information that provides a little bit of insight into the infrastructure of the company. You're also going to look at if they got any exceptions, right? And the management response there. That tells you a lot. Doesn't tell you necessarily what you need from this supplier as a business, right? A security questionnaire gives more insight. If you don't need that insight at that point in your company, then that might be enough for you. But typically you want to know a little bit more. If you've got a security team, they're going to ask questions maybe about application security that a SOC 2 isn't going to go into. To Kelly's point, if you do any business with the EU, you're going to have GDPR type questions that you need to ask. And as we're realizing, even as a country that's passing more and more privacy regulations, you should ask about those questions regardless. So I think a SOC 2 can be great as a baseline. If you have the time and the resourcing, I think a questionnaire really gives you more insight into what specifically you need and what baselines you're looking for a company to meet that a SOC 2 or even an ISO cert doesn't totally give you that assurance from.
Absolutely. Yes. It's good to look for those badges. It's a strong start, but still worth a little extra poking and prodding beyond that. Since you're heavily involved in the buyer side mindset, Kim, I'll also ask you, when's the right time to send out these questionnaires? I think often we hear stories of them being the last, oh, I'm ready to sign a contract, but let's quick do a security questionnaire. Let me send this to you quickly. But for companies who are looking to be a little bit more strategic or proactive, when's the right time to engage at that level with a new vendor?
So I'm biased. I want to say as early as possible. I know that doesn't always work for someone who's a buyer in sales or in HR, frankly, because they need to consider other factors when you're, whether you're going to commit to a contract or not. Legal is going to be involved. Finance is going to be involved. There's a lot of players, right, with any new supplier that you're bringing on. I think there are baseline questions that you can ask pretty early on in the process. Those questions can be, hey, do you have a SOC 2? Do you have a process to delete data? What happens if X or Y happens? What sort of data do you touch on our side if we were to go into business with you? I think those are great questions that are essentially like a short-term questionnaire to have right out the gate. Then when time goes by, obviously before you're ready to sign, it's never ideal to have a questionnaire sent out in the morning, and if all goes well, you're signing in the evening. But I think as early as possible, once you get a gauge of this is a supplier we definitely want to use, finance is on board, legal's taking a look at the terms, you want to have a chance to review a questionnaire. You also want to make sure there's time for back and forth, right? If you're not just checking a box, there's usually going to be a conversation. Hey, you answered this question in this way. Can you give a little bit more detail? Or, hey, you don't have this in place. Can you give a little bit more understanding as to why that is? So biased answer early as possible. I'd say as a middle ground, some questions very, very early on, and then before legal and finance are really closing, get a chance to send out a more formal questionnaire.
Excellent advice. Love that. Kim, you brought up this idea of back and forth, and John, you mentioned earlier as well that you send these questionnaires out, inevitably they're going to come back and they shouldn't be ignored. That's the point where the conversation should really begin. John, I'm wondering if you have a short list of 2 or 3 of the big red flags that people should look for when they get a security questionnaire back and they're combing through responses. What should jump off of the page to them as something to follow up on?
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the questionnaire itself. For instance, the cake and that, there's areas where, you have yes, no, or not applicable. And then, of course, we now have the shared responsibility model. So, which raised a lot of eyebrows. People would, we found out a lot of people weren't really sure who was responsible for what. So, those types of things of, to me, I always raise my eyebrows at the non-applicables. And the areas where they're not really sure about who's responsible for what. So it shows a little bit maybe that they're a little fragmented in some cases, or maybe they're just trying to get through the questionnaire without too many issues, and so they're just again just putting in answers, for me, looking at the what they're saying is not applicable, lack of evidence and comments, if they're just doing yes, no down the line, they're not actually providing any evidence. And, some questionnaires require it, some don't. But good questionnaires always ask for some sort of evidence if possible. And so that's, to me, that raises a big red flag when you have, and that's what we tell our members as well, because we have the STAR registry, which is publicly available to anybody who wants to look at it, right? So right off the bat, the users raise their eyebrows when, number one, they just do the minimum yes, no answers and go on, or they have all these non-applicables with no real justification of why it's not applicable. So yeah, those are the types of things that make you wonder, how truthful they are.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially for questionnaire topics around internal practices or policies that are in place. Like, yes, there may be yes or no questions, but it's really the color and the context behind that tells you how a company is bringing those policies to life and what they're doing day to day to keep you secure, keep your customers secure or not. So I think that's looking for those non-applicables is a great tip.
Yeah, if they really want your business, they'll put some context to the answers they get.
Yeah. Kelly, I know this is an area that at HyperComply we are working on productizing as well, making the questionnaire responses a little bit easier to navigate. What are some things you've learned in this space, or do you have any tips or tricks for folks when they get that questionnaire back, how to process it and think about it on their end?
On the review side, Yes. So I think to echo John's point, when you're reviewing something like a cake light or a SIG light, it's the no answers or the not applicables that you really want to take a close look at. And you hope that when somebody said, no, I don't have this thing that you're asking for, that they provide you with some context. Like, we're not SOC 2 certified yet, but we are in the process of becoming SOC 2 certified, or we don't have a formal security policy yet, because I don't know what actually an acceptable answer to that would be for me. But that's kind of where I look when reviewing answers to a security questionnaire. And then I also, something that I always find really comforting in a company is if they do have clear ownership of security and privacy. So there's somebody on the executive team representing that interest, like a CISO, or there is a security and compliance team. If there's nobody in the company who owns security and compliance, that's concerning to me.
Interesting. Curious, Kim, how do you think about ownership of this? Obviously, you are in a security and compliance role, but I'm taking a leap here and assuming you are not the only one involved in this process. So how do you build that kind of ownership when it is, distributed a bit throughout the company?
Yeah, so I think there is some clear ownership that security in general is going to care the most about security questionnaires. That's totally fair. I think when you look at the types of questions that you're asking, I think there are sometimes a clear distinction, and sometimes you have to think about it, but of departments that are going to care about this answer, right? Application security questions, those impact engineers as well as security folks. When you're looking at HR and sort of employee-based controls, that's indicating to an HR team who's going to care about that as well. When it comes to how a supplier is going to use their infrastructure to actually use an API or what have you to set up the product, that's going to impact the product people, but also those who are going to be using the tool, which could be anyone at your company, depending on what it is. So I think when you're doing a first review, it's always great to have security as the person who goes, hey, what kind of risk does this present to the business? But depending on what that actually means from a practical standpoint, how does this change how we're going to be using this? I think that's a great time to say, who else is really going to care about this answer, and make it more of a collaborative approach, again, with time and resources permitting.
Yep, absolutely. All boils down to who's got time, who can help turn this around. Great. Thank you all. Thanks for answering those initial questions. We're going to shift gears a little bit now and do some Q&A. We have lots of people sending questions ahead of time. If you are watching live with us now and you have burning security questionnaire topics you would like to learn more about, feel free to add those in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll go through those right now. I'll kick things off with a couple of questions that we got as people were registering for this event. And the first one, John, I'm going to toss this to you, is are there certain industries that receive a higher influx of sales and security questionnaires? Where do we see these happening the most?
Well, honestly, I know this might seem strange since I work for CSA, but it is, cloud security. I've had people, make the statement that computing actually is the cloud today, and that is what, a large percentage, especially since COVID, we saw just an extreme upsurge in transitions to the cloud and the adoption of the cloud. So, we get it's a huge issue for people. They're still trying to get their arms around the trust and assurance in the cloud. So naturally, they tend to send out and rely on a huge amount of questionnaires, because you not only can't really audit these cloud organizations, but they wouldn't let you in if you wanted to. So it becomes, a real issue. And questionnaires is your only first line of defense to understand the transparency, what they're doing, and the accountability, and to be able to build that trust in the cloud, because in many cases that's all you have. There's so many organizations, large, small, medium-sized organizations. Most of your small and medium-sized organizations aren't able to mandate what their cloud service providers need to have, because they're not big enough. So the CSPs aren't even going to pay attention to them. They go, here's our terms and conditions. If you don't like it, you get to go somewhere else. So these questionnaires, and that's why the STAR registry exists, is it's publicly available. So they may have, they have been mandated to upload this questionnaire by one of their larger customers, but you may be a smaller customer. You can take advantage of that because it's the same questionnaire that the large customers are asking for. So, yeah, cloud to me has become, probably one of the biggest areas that people, push out questionnaires and have the biggest question marks about.
To help people who are probably trying to prioritize, I'll flip this question on its head. Who do you not need to send a security questionnaire to? Are there categories like, maybe for folks who are in an office, you have a mail carrier or an office cleaning crew who comes once a month. Like, are there categories that you don't need to worry about sending security questionnaires to?
No, not really, because to be honest, some of your biggest security issues are around the people that clean the offices or the people that are mopping the floors of the data centers. So if you have services like that, those people are security threats, probably more so than other people, because they're usually after hours. There's very few people around. There's not a so you have to understand, what they're, but having said that, it's all about risk appetite and your risk assessment. These questionnaires should be driven by your risk assessment. Who are your, what suppliers are your critical suppliers? Some companies have 5,000 suppliers. Wow. Why do I can't send questionnaires to 5,000 people. I have to do risk assessment. I have to understand where my risks are, where, my risk appetite. And then those questionnaires need to go to the critical suppliers. And to your point, Cake Light, that could be something you send to your lower risk people, because it's a shorter list. Gives you the questions that you really want to have, that pretty much any organization should answer. So it helps from that perspective too. So it's really a tiered level of decision making of who you send it to and how long those questionnaires need to be and how many need to go out.
Awesome. Super helpful. We've got a couple more questions coming in live, so I want to make sure we get to these. One is a really poignant question. We've been talking a lot about the process and managing sending and receiving and reviewing questionnaires, but somebody's asking a question about validating those answers. How do you know that the information that a vendor has provided is truthful and accurate? Kim, do you want to talk a little bit about how you think about this and building trust with vendors?
I love that question, because that's a sign that you care more about a questionnaire than just doing that checkbox. That's a good thing to ask yourself. How do you validate it? I think it gets a little bit into what we were talking about earlier too. Yes or no questions and answers don't actually tell you that much at the end of the day. I don't think you will ever have 100% assurance that someone isn't, extrapolating a little bit or giving you maybe a slight version that isn't 100% true. But the best way you can do that from a questionnaire perspective is being sure that you're asking questions that A, you care about, and B, in a way that the answer is going to be effective. If you're creating a custom questionnaire, which I commend you, that's awesome, don't ask, do you do this? Ask, how do you do this? How do you implement this? Require people to give a little bit of insight into their answer, so it's not easy to just say yes and just check the list as you're going down. I think that can give you some insight. I also think that if you're doing a questionnaire, you typically don't just want answers to questions, right? You want to see evidence as proof of that. So not just, do you have a SOC 2? If you have a SOC 2, can you provide that? Do you have an information security policy? Can you share that? I think we trust SOC 2s in the fact that they are, in of themselves attested to by an auditor who looked at evidence. I think a questionnaire process is a little similar. You want to ask people, hey, can you provide this? Can I take a look? Do you have a architecture diagram that I can look at when you're talking about how our data is going to be passed along within your systems? So I think best as possible, frame your questions in a way that is helpful, but also feel free to ask, a supplier if they can give you that information back so you can review it yourself.
Awesome. Those seem like two such easy, actionable tips. I love that, Kim. Switching from yes, no to how do you to get more insight, and asking for that evidence up front seems like a no-brainer for a lot of people. Thanks. Another question that we just got, Kelly, I'm going to toss this one your way, is about our crystal ball, the future state of security questionnaires and how this might evolve over time. Where do you see this space going? What do you think some of the changes that we see over the next few years might look like?
Yeah, so I see a lot of companies, both large and small, moving to a model where they make their security posture public, or if not fully public, at least posted somewhere that's easily accessible that they can grant their customers and prospects access to. That way, I, as a purchaser, can go and do due diligence in a sort of self-serve way, get all the information that I can from their publicly posted information, and then I'm left with the delta of maybe 5 or 10 topics that I need to dig into a little bit more deeply, ask some follow-up questions, and complete my due diligence that way. What we're really trying to do is eliminate all the duplicative work that we need to do from vendor to vendor to vendor, right? There's this core set of information that everybody wants and needs. And if we can make that readily available for those who are conducting due diligence, that saves everybody time. And then, I think it's a little bit of a pipe dream to think that there's going to just the public security posture is going to solve all problems in the world, because there are custom needs that you need to look into as a business. But if we can reduce that conversation from 100 questions that are answered again and again and again to just those 5 questions that you need that's custom to your business, that's the way that we all can move forward more quickly.
Awesome. We got a few questions that were about what are the questions that I need to ask, right? Like, what are the specific things that I should put in there? And if you have magical answers, I would love to hear them. But I think, Kelly, you gave some good framing there that most of the questions should be pretty standardized and consistent across vendors that you work with. But coming up with that handful of things that really matter to your business is probably about things that you've all brought up, looking at your business risk profile, looking at the ways in which you'll work with this vendor and what that relationship is like. Any other advice in figuring out what those kind of custom areas or specific areas to poke at should be?
I think starting with your own compliance certifications and looking at what's required by those is a good place to start. And then also assessing your company's appetite for risk. We talk to companies across a bunch of different industry, a bunch of different sizes, and some of them are extremely risk averse and willing to accept the extra work that goes into being risk averse in assessing vendors and in taking security measures internally. And others are not so risk averse because they're focused on speed. So, for example, smaller companies, they're not focused on mitigating risk yet. They're focused on moving really, really quickly. And so those kind of standard risk assessment frameworks, just getting a cake light or getting in SOC 2 can be enough for those companies. So that's a good place to start. But I'm sure that John and Kim can add to that.
Yeah, John, do you have in your back pocket any tips and recommendations for where people should look to start?
Yeah, well, yeah, I agree 100% with pretty much everything Kelly had to say, including, the risk assessment and risk appetite first and foremost, because then you're answering the questions that really mean something to you instead of these perceived risks that you got off the internet or someone, some salesperson told you that this is the questionnaire that you need to use. You do have to use risk assessment because top management wants to know that as well. If you're in procurement, top management wants to understand, what is their risk, with these different vendors. So you have to start there and really, boil it down to the questions that matter. And yes, some people do use SOC 2 and ISO and STAR certification, which comes from CSA, which is essentially SOC 2 and R 27001 with the additional requirements for the cloud. So those are sector specific certifications. And some people do ask those, as they do accept those. as long as you keep your certification, we won't send you any more questionnaires type things, but again, that's based on their risk appetite. The last thing I agree with that, again, Kelly brought out there is the public, having these questionnaires in a public domain, like the Star Registry, where everyone can see it. So regardless of how big, small you are as an organization, if you want to use a vendor, you look on the registry. If they're there, hey, I can look at their questionnaire. I can look at all their answers. I don't have to vet that. I've already answered the questions. Some organizations don't have the budget to create, analyze, and follow up on questionnaires. So they need something like that helps them out.
Absolutely. Yeah. John, you and Kelly just both touched on the idea that your ability to vet vendors is going to be based on your resources and the scale of your company. And Kim, I'm curious, as an in-house security and compliance person, how do you manage that balance of enabling your team to move quickly and prioritize growth, getting new tools and vendors on board, with managing the long-term impact of those decisions and keeping your company secure? How do you manage that balance?
Yeah, I think one of the not so easy things to do, but one of the more broad ways to look at it is to view the security process, the questionnaires, all of that working with security team as a partnership with the other departments, right? It's really one step in the procurement process. And I think you need to acknowledge that and work with the other people who are involved with that. Whether you've got you've got in-house procurement or you're using vendor, honestly, we think it's really important to look at it as sort of a group effort. I think the other thing to keep in mind is a security questionnaire should never just be a one-off send into the universe and then great, you get your answers back. If you're doing your due diligence, you're sending out a questionnaire or a type of questionnaire annually at the very least. You're checking in, especially on critical suppliers and vendors, on a regular basis. That might be as simple as saying, hey, here's the questionnaire you submitted last year. Has anything changed? But it could be, hey, here are new questions that we want to add to this. Hey, can you give us an idea of how your company has changed and understanding what new documentation we should be looking at? So I think keeping an eye on your vendor management program, keeping an eye on what vendors you have, but making sure that you're looking at new documents when a new SOC 2 comes in for a vendor, and not forgetting that one-off questionnaire needs to be updated.
Yeah, that is such a good point. You go through all this trouble and this work to understand a vendor's security posture today, and then you don't follow up. And who knows, the next day they've hired new people at their company, they've put new processes in place. So what is the best practice here? Is annually the threshold that companies should be aiming for? Is it more often, less often? What do you recommend?
I think annually for a lot of suppliers will be sufficient enough. I think, again, though, it depends, right? Do you have the resources to look at that information if you're asking for it more often? Maybe you should be asking more often. I think it's a good idea, too, to note that sometimes critical changes can happen within a year where you need to have updated information. If a company that you use just underwent an acquisition, if they just went through an ownership change, those are some big changes that you are going to want to have an updated questionnaire. So I'd say aim for annual because I think that's reasonable, but look at what actually makes sense for your business. If it's something like a critical vendor that if something changed or went wrong, you know that your business itself would be at risk, maybe you need to do a little bit more often, or at the very least put in stipulations with the questionnaire that if anything changes in their answers, they're going to give you a call and give you that updated information.
Another excellent tip, put the burden on them to alert you so that hopefully they can be proactive and give you a heads up when things are changing on their side. And you can determine if and when to dive in.
Yeah.
All right, I know we are coming right up on time. I wanted to thank all of our panelists here who have spent their valuable time chatting with us a little bit. John, Kim, and Kelly, thank you so much for sharing your insights into this wild world of security questionnaires. It's been fun picking your brains, learning a bit more about your day-to-day and how you interact with these questionnaires on an ongoing basis. And thanks for all the tips that you shared for our viewers.
Thanks so much,
thanks,
Ashley.
All right.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody who tuned in. Hopefully we'll see you at more upcoming events soon.